10. Was it just him, or were the corridors on 8 brighter than the ones on the ship? They were standard Coalition architecture, all gray and white with rounded edges and soothing forms, but for some reason things seemed brighter over here. Cass wasn't sure what it was, but it had distracted him long enough to get to Admiral Sangvi's office. He pressed the small button beside the door. "Enter," the Admiral's voice said through the speaker embedded in the wall. The door slid open to reveal the same room he'd been in only a few days before, watching his future slip away from him. "Mr. Robeaux." Admiral Sangvi stood and stuck out his hand, taking Cass's with some force. Sangvi was a large man and very strong. He looked like the kind of man who could pick up a flag on a battlefield and lead troops into battle. He'd never taken the time to research Sangvi's service record, but it was a good bet there was some combat in there somewhere. "I understand you had a run-in with some of the crew of the Persephone." Cass took a seat and scoffed. Word of my pardon didn't spread very fast. Sangvi ignored the jab, if he'd even caught it at all, which Cass bet he had. That was by design. "I'm sorry, but I didn't want the media nets to catch wind of it, not when we're about to ship you off on another mission. And frankly, I'd like to keep it that way. The less people know you're back in Coalition space, the better, for the time being." "Then you better get a hold of those 3 guys who jumped me. They heard the news from somewhere, and I bet they can't wait to tell their friends about the traitor they beat up." "It's already been taken care of," Sangvi said, making a dismissive wave with his hand. Cass was nonplussed. "You look like you're not used to people standing up for you." "Can you blame me, after what Rutledge did?" Sangvi tapped a few panels on his desk. "I see you paid him a visit as well." "I needed to know what kind of hornet's nest I was about to get myself into. Sir, I don't know how many times I can say this, but this is a suicide mission. Even if we manage not to die out there contacting the Sill, they will either wait for the threat to destroy us and deal with it on their own, or they'll send an invasion force into Coalition space and occupy the territory. But more than likely, they'll take one look at the Tempest and blow it out of the sky." Sangvi regarded him for a moment. "I appreciate your candor, but we are low on choices at the moment, and it is your job to make sure none of those things happens. We want the Sill to join forces with us, not conquer us, and not wait for us to be annihilated. And I know it's a lot to ask, but my hope is the compassion you showed them." Yeah, Cass said. "I know the reasons. I don't agree with them." Sangvi leaned forward. "Does that mean you're rejecting the mission?" Cass pursed his lips, working his jaw. "And if I did? You'd make me go anyway. I'm not stupid. I know I don't have a choice here. But at least you're being courteous enough to give me the illusion of choice. It's what the Coalition is best at. I'm sorry your time in the Coalition wasn't what you expected. But we can't allow assets to go unused. And right now, you are an asset. The moment you start to become a liability again, I'll be happy to send you off into the sunset." Cass wasn't sure if he meant letting him go or killing him, but he didn't want to press to find out. Sangvi sat back in his chair again. "The reason I asked you here is I wanted to offer to reinstate your commission, back to your original rank. I'd need you to pass a competency test, but none of the other requirements. Your rank was unfairly stripped from you, and I'd like to right that wrong." Cass dropped his gaze, staring at the floor a moment. He hadn't expected this, but on some level he'd known it was coming. Hadn't this been what he'd wanted ever since he'd been thrown in that prison 7 years ago? Wasn't this the retribution he'd been seeking? And it would probably make life on the Tempest more bearable. The rest of the crew would have to be much more careful insulting him, and he'd be able to shut down anything he didn't like with a simple order. "Thank you, Admiral, but I have to decline." Sangvi arched an eyebrow, but otherwise remained still as stone. "I'm not sure you'd understand, sir, but that rank, This job, everything I left behind, that was a different person. That person believed in the purity of the coalition, and that person died in prison. The one who sits before you today isn't the same man, and he didn't earn that rank." "I see," Zangvi said softly. "But I appreciate the offer." Cass stood, flattening the front of his shirt as he did. "If there's nothing else?" "I've been getting reports your robot is out of control over on Tempest. I'm not sure it's a good idea to take it with you. Perhaps just leave it on the station. I can have some techs take a look and fix any kind of malfunction it might be experiencing." Cass couldn't say he was surprised. He'd left Box over there alone and without a chaperone. Last time it had been different because Box could stay on their ship and keep himself occupied and out of the way. But now it was like he'd been untethered. Cass wasn't sure if it was all part of this identity crisis Box had been talking about, or if it was his usual nature and this was what he did when he was bored. "What kind of reports?" "It's threatened some of the crew with physical violence. And I have to tell you, that doesn't instill a lot of confidence in me. One hit, and that thing could kill a person. All it takes is a minor malfunction." Zangvi spread his arms out so his fists rested in the middle of the table. "I could say the same thing about humans." "I'll take care of it, sir. He's just bored." "Where did you find it, anyway?" "I've never seen another machine quite like it," the admiral asked. I found him after I reached Sargan space, after the parole incident," Cass lied. Zangvi didn't need to know Box's origins, and Cass wasn't about to spill them. "I spent a couple of years tinkering with him, making him better, more efficient, and more alive, but that was a complete accident. Before you leave, I want it evaluated. Have Commander Zahl administer the tests. I'll need her to sign off on its condition before you depart." Cass sighed, staring at the space next to the admiral's ear, unable to look him in the eye. Box didn't need an evaluation. He needed a job, something to keep him occupied. But he certainly wasn't about to leave him on Starbase 8 unattended. More than likely, he'd come back, if they came back at all, to a crate full of spare parts and a "Sorry, we tried." "I'll take care of it," Cass said, the sliding doors opening for him. "See that you do. And good luck." "You have to be kidding me," Cass said, stepping into the room. Though stepping was a generous term, squeezing would be more accurate. "Not kidding." Box stood in the corner, his display projected against the wall less than a meter in front of him, showing a new net drama. "What's wrong? Different from the size you ordered?" Cass took the room in. It couldn't be more than 3 meters square in any direction. The crates he left with Box stood stacked beside the door, shoved against the wall. A small bed occupied most of the room, but there was no way it could fit a human adult, much less provide any kind of comfort. There has to be a mistake. I'll talk to Evie, or the requisitions officer. They can't honestly expect us to both stay in this room. It's a quarter of the size of my quarters and the reasonable excuse. "Some of us didn't even have quarters," Box mumbled. "Where was the lavatory? Or the kitchen? Or the windows? It's like someone took a closet and shoved a bed in here." According to the ship's schematics, this was a storage unit. Up until about a day ago, when the updated plans for the ship were released. "You know they performed some updates, right?" Box asked, absently watching his program. "Yeah, I saw the work on the bridge," Cass replied. "But are they really so hard up for space they had to put us in here?" He tried squeezing around the crates to the bed. Box raised and lowered his shoulders, not breaking his attention span. "Not my problem. I'm perfectly comfortable over here." "Oh, and that's another thing," Cass said. "You're about one misstep away from being kicked off this ship." Box shut the show down and stared at him, his yellow eyes blinking rapidly. "He provoked me." "Who?" "Lieutenant Rond. He tried to trick me with a logic test. He thought it would make me malfunction, Box protested, scooting forward. But he's never met a Class 117 autonomous mining robot before. We're not like a drone. Otherwise, he'd know even the simplest of us are designed to ignore logic fallacies. I can't believe he'd think I was so stupid How do you know it wasn't a mistake? Or a joke, Cass asked, cutting off Box's rant. Though Rond had been ambivalent toward him as well from the very start. That first day on the bridge had been particularly uncomfortable. Oh, I know, Box replied. You were right. I do have to put up with a lot of bullshit here. And my bullshit meter is already this full. He held up his hand above his head. Stick a dampener on whatever you're doing, because it got reported to the admiral. And now I have to get Evie to administer and sign off on an evaluation because of your behavior. Cass gave up trying to get to the bed and made his way back toward the door. Evaluation for what? Box asked. To make sure you're not a threat to the crew. Box made a buzzing noise deep within, a sign of frustration. He leaned back against the wall again and turned on his device, resuming his net drama. Cass placed his hands on his hips, staring at the tiny space a moment. Even though he didn't have it on him, he still wore the holster under his jacket for the boom cannon. If this had been a Sargan ship, all he'd have to do was go to the nearest officer, threaten their life, and get them to move them to better quarters. But here in the Coalition, it was a lot different. He had to make a complaint, fill out requisition forms, wait the predetermined amount of time, etc., etc. The Sargans might have been a hotbed of crime and death, but it was a hell of a lot easier to get things done over there. I'll be back, he said, leaving through the doors. I need to fix. 11. The hypervator doors opened on the brand-new bridge, giving Cass pause. He'd been so accustomed to the old bridge layout, it took him a moment to adjust to this new one. Gone was the center 3D display, replaced by a more traditional 2D display on the far wall opposite the hypervator where the Master Systems display used to be. The MSD had been relegated to the left side of the new display, while the helm and navigation stations had been positioned closest to the view screen, with the operations and tactical stations situated behind them at a slight angle. Closest to him was the bridge engineering and the specialist stations, positioned furthest away from the screen, as they were the least crucial posts on the bridge. Technically, both could be empty, and the bridge wouldn't lose any functionality. In the center of the room, right where the impressive 3D display once stood, were the captain and executive officers' chairs, facing the new display. Cass glanced down. Even the floors had been changed to reflect the changes, with the floor plates having been coated with new colors to help navigate the area. Evie turned in her chair as he entered, giving him a supportive smile, and returned her attention to the front. Prepare to depart, Green ordered. Each person focused on the work at their respective stations. Moorings have been cleared, Zahl said. Ready, Captain. Lieutenant, at your leisure, Green said. Rond nodded without glancing back and worked his controls. The view through the view screen rotated around, indicating Rond was turning the ship in a counterclockwise direction. As soon as the ship was straight again, it drove forward to the giant hatch in the side of Starbase 8. Cass couldn't help but feel a pang of longing as the ship left its moorings and began its departure. In another life, it would have been him on the bridge giving the orders, preparing to explore the great unknown. Approaching terminus, Ensign River announced. She had taken over for Blackburn at the navigation station, and Cass noticed her hands were cybernetic replacements. She also had a small augmentation close to her eye, which was mostly obscured by her short neon green hair. She seemed anxious in her new role. It was never easy taking over for a fallen comrade, especially when the death had happened right here on the bridge. The opening approached, the starfield beyond nothing but white specks in a sea of night. As they passed through the force barrier to open space, Cass couldn't help but feel a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't sad about leaving 8, far from it. but rather it felt more like leaving another life behind, the one he'd crafted for himself after being ejected from the Coalition. Here he was, on a Coalition ship for the second time in as many weeks, preparing to engage in a dangerous mission. He'd sworn he'd never find himself here again. But life never tended to go the way he'd expected. "We're clear, Captain," Ron said. He turned to look back and caught sight of Cass. Something flashed over his face, but it was gone before Cass could discern what it had been. "Set course for Quaval." Green's voice reflected the seriousness of the coordinates. Quaval was one of the few charted systems in Sill's space, and the closest to their current position. It had been where Rutledge had first taken them on the Atlas. No doubt it was Green's plan to use Cass's familiarity with the area to give them any kind of advantage. "Find the nearest undercurrent and send us through as soon as we're within range." "Aye," Rond and River said in unison, sharing a brief glance. Green stood. "Now that we are underway, I can reveal more about our mission, though this information is classified to officer-level clearance only. If I hear any of the crew talking about this, I will find who decided to leak the information." "There's only one person on this bridge who's a known traitor. Start there," Page said, staring at Cass. Green ignored him. "Our mission is to reach and make contact with the Sill." There was a gasp in the room, though Cass couldn't tell where it had originated. "Mr. Robeaux will be our point man. He is the only human who has ever assisted the Sill in any way, and Coalition Central thinks he is our way in." "But why?" Blum asked. "What do we need the Sill for?" "That's classified," Green replied. "Just know that we wouldn't be taking these steps were they not absolutely necessary." Page scoffed. "We will be using the same route taken by the Atlas 7 years ago," Green continued. "Hopefully, that will give us a small advantage as we are, for lack of a better word, flying into their space blind. But the hope is they will recognize and appreciate what Mr. Robeaux did for them and agree to talk." "Captain, what is the end game?" Zahl asked, his voice deep and heavy. "What does Coalition Central think we can accomplish?" "We would like to broker a peace, an opportunity to share information," Green said. "I can't say more than that. But any situation in which we leave in one piece, I will consider a win." The rest of the bridge officers exchanged looks, many of them turning to Cass, then turning back to the captain again. Evie remained stone-faced. Green turned to Evie. "Commander, the bridge is yours. Notify me of any problems." "Yes, Captain," Evie said, staying in her seat. Green made his way to his command room, motioning for Cass to follow him. Once inside, Green indicated Cass take a seat. "I assume you didn't ask me here to parade me in front of the bridge," Cass said. Green raised his eyebrows. "No, but having you there helped. I'm not a fool. I know there was a lot of animosity toward you from this crew. There would be on any ship. But we don't have the luxury of making the crew love you. We have a job to do, and I am going to see it gets done one way or another." He paused. "Since it will take us between 30 and 35 days to reach Sill space, I wanted to get your thoughts on a strategy and spend some time going over it with you and the new negotiator. Have you met her yet?" Cass shook his head. His last 12 hours had been spent shuffling from requisitions officer to requisitions officer, having little to no luck on procuring a new room. He couldn't help but think someone was deliberately blocking him, but he didn't have the proof yet. "When you get a chance, take some time to see her. She's one of the best in the Coalition and will help guide you through this process. I expect by the time we reach Sill space, you to be well versed in diplomatic protocol. We have one chance at this and can't afford to screw it up." "I'm aware," Cass said, an edge in his voice. He didn't need anyone telling him how important his role here was. All this had taken its toll, and he felt like he could sleep for about a week. But there was little chance of it with that tiny bed in his room. Green regarded him. "Are you all right, Robeaux? You look tired. It's nothing. I'm not used to not being on my own ship. Then see you get some rest. But I want you to be on the bridge for the second shift change each day. We'll be passing through an area of space not often traversed, and I want you to be caught up on everything we're encountering. Consider yourself a temporary bridge crew member. Cass sat back, having not expected this. Captain, I'm not sure I'm the person you want. Are you trying to tell me how to run my own ship, Mr. Robeaux? Green asked, challenging him. The fact is, you need to be apprised of what is happening every day, whether you want to or not. I had one last thing I wanted to discuss with you. Cass glared at him, wondering how much worse this could get. Have you considered wearing a Coalition uniform again? By his sides, Cass's hands flexed into fists and back, clawing at the material of the chair. I haven't, but I'll take it under advisement. Excellent, Green replied. I believe it would be helpful to present a united front to the Sill, show them we're professional, organized, and serious. Was there anything else? He asked. No, but make sure you take the time to meet with Negotiator Laska. Today, if possible. 30 days may seem like a long time, but we'll be there before we know it. Cass nodded and stood, still fuming over the suggestion he wear a uniform. If he had any say in the matter, he'd never put that piece of cloth on again. He'd come on their ship, he'd even help them in their negotiation. He'd sit on the bridge for a daily briefing for as long as the captain wanted him there. But one thing he would never do would be to put that uniform on again. Not after everything they had done to him. It represented something tainted and treacherous, and Cass wouldn't have it. He exited through the sliding doors without another look at Green, doing his best to keep his cool. As he turned to head back toward the hypervator, he locked eyes with Joro Page, who wore a sinister sneer on his face. His lip was curled so Cass could even see his teeth underneath, and yet it was twisted in a way that if he looked at it right, it could resemble a smile. Cass narrowed his eyes and made a detour over to Evie. Do you have a second? He asked. When he glanced back, Page still hadn't taken his eyes off him. Sure. She tapped a button on her chair. Lieutenant, notify me when we reach the undercurrent, she said to Zahl, whose robed head bobbed in response. She stood and escorted Cass to the hypervator doors. What's going on? She asked. I've been trying for the past 12 hours to find out who assigned me and Box a closet for quarters. But I keep getting the runaround. I can't believe every available space on this ship is full. Evie furrowed her brow. It's not. We have plenty of rooms available. Did you say you were in a closet? Up on 7. We're in what seems to be a maintenance storage room. Evie glanced over her shoulder, then back at Cass again. I'll take care of it. I think I know what's going on. It's Paige, isn't it? He asked. I'll tell you later. But you might wish you still had your old commission before this mission is over, she said, frustration in her voice. The admiral offered, but I refused, he said. He wanted to get off the bridge, get back down to his quarters. Now that he'd hopefully taken care of his housing problem, he didn't need to be here anymore. What? She said. Why? You would have been the third highest ranked person on the ship if you had. It wouldn't be right, he replied. I'm not the same person I was when I earned that rank. A lot has happened since then. Plus, I would have to wear, he gestured to her uniform. You don't want to take a downgrade, Captain, she smirked. Who would want to go back to being a commander after running his own ship for so long? He forced a smile. Yeah. Thanks for your help in the room. I'm going to pack what little we unpacked. You got it. Lunch tomorrow? She asked. The weight on his back seemed to lift briefly, as if a pulley had raised it up slightly, so he wasn't holding so much all at once. Sounds great. She nodded, then returned to her station. Mr. Zahl? How close? She asked as the hypervator doors opened for Cass. Another 100,000 kilometers, he replied in that heavy voice of his. Cass sighed. As the doors closed, he caught one last look at Paige, who appeared to be laughing to himself. 12. Former Commander Robeaux, please report to Meeting Room Epsilon immediately, Cass's comm chirped. It happened to come on as he passed another crew member in the hallway, who glanced over at him with disgust. He needed to change his settings, so it only notified him of a comm and didn't blurt it out for everyone around him to hear. Meeting Room Epsilon? What could be down there? The voice had been a woman's, but it had been shrill and serious. Former Commander, do you read me? The comm chirped again. Cass grabbed it and tapped it. This is Robeaux, he said. Who is this? Negotiator Laska. Captain Green notified me you were ready to meet. I would like to begin as soon as possible. From the sound of it, she wasn't a woman to be trifled with, but also thought a lot of herself. What if he was in the middle of a job or a shower? It was best to get this over with. Fine, I'll be there momentarily, Cass replied. The comm chirped again. And make sure you bring a better attitude than the one I'm hearing. I'm not about to waste my time on someone who will not take these negotiations seriously. There won't be any negotiations at all if we're not careful. I'll be there in a few minutes, Cass replied, turning off his comm. Every time the stupid thing beeped now, it sent a shock of anxiety through his system. He wasn't used to having all these people around who could contact him. He'd hoped falling back into his old routines would be easy, making jokes with the crew, performing his daily duties, a structured routine. But it hadn't been like that at all. He was miserable, and he knew it. Before, when he'd still had his ship and the promise of leaving the Coalition forever, he'd been much more hopeful. Now everything seemed like it was falling apart. He took the closest hypervator down to Meeting Room Epsilon, expecting to meet a someone who reminded him of his professors back at the academy. There had been one, Professor Arxa, xenobiology. She'd been the strictest person he'd ever met, requiring the students to be perfect in their knowledge of alien species, their traits, and their histories. She had said the entire back of the Coalition was made up of each person understanding where someone else came from, even if they didn't come from the same planet as you. Cass had hated her with a passion, but she was the professor he remembered the clearest, and some of her lessons had even helped him back when he'd been in the Sargan Commonwealth. It turned out, when you knew a little bit about a person's planetary history, they were much more likely to buy you a couple more rounds, rather than punch your face in. The door to the room slid open, revealing what Cass thought at first was a child. But as he stood in the doorway, he realized she was in fact a full-grown person. She happened to be a little over a meter tall. Her dark black hair was swept back and pinned to her head, the back of it done up in an ornate but classy bun. Her dark eyes seemed to pierce his very soul, and she held a long black stick of some sort. To Cass it looked to be made of polymer. Carbonite? He couldn't be sure. Former Commander Robeaux, I presume, she announced, somehow managing to look down on him, despite the fact he was a good half-meter taller than her. He stuck out his hand awkwardly as he entered, trying his best not to be rude. Yes, and you must be smack! Cass retracted his hand, the back of it welting up with a red mark. He hadn't even seen her move the stick. God damn it! Ow! He yelled. You are not to initiate physical contact with any being without first gaining their consent. Improper physical relations led to the 12 Years' War between the Maxians and the Onorgathi. We will not be making the same mistake in this classroom. Classroom? Cass asked. He glanced around. There was one small chair with a desk facing a larger desk at the end of the room, and on the far wall an interactive board. Am I going to school? Smack! Damn it! Stop hitting me!
We will not be speaking out of turn in this classroom. Improper adherence to verbal contracts caused a threefold rift in the Lek-Mekal Empire, leading to 200 years of famine for its people. We do not want to be unleashing any plagues in here, do we, former commander?
Cass held his hand, rubbing the back of it, afraid to respond or move. She was quick as a whip with that thing. He had an urge to tackle her and wrench it from her grasp. She was small. What were the odds he'd get it before she beat him to death?
Very good, former commander,
she replied, turning to her right with the practiced motion of someone who had run military drills.
You didn't speak out of turn a second time. It seems you can learn after all. You may answer the question.
I have to have permission to answer a question you've asked me? Isn't an answer implied within the question itself? He asked.
Not if you're dealing with a Runestadt.
She walked to the front of the room and around the large desk, stepping up on something behind it so she was visible over the edge. She placed the stick in the middle of the empty desk. Am I dealing with a Runestadt? Cass asked, attempting to duplicate the inflection the woman had used. She sighed, drawing her brows together.
No, I am Zahl. I'm surprised you didn't know. They told me you were well-versed in other cultures, but I see I have my work cut out for me.
Cass approached slowly. You'll have to forgive me. It's been a long time since I've met one of your people, and they weren't the friendliest of people.
That's a diplomatic way of saying we're hermits, she announced.
For all intents and purposes, she appeared human, just more diminutive in stature. Sturdier, like a piece of unbreakable stone.
You've never paid a visit to Vallis, have you?
He shook his head.
I might have figured. Do yourself a favor. Take the time to visit sometime. You might be surprised if you're willing to open your eyes to another culture.
I visited plenty of worlds, Cass said, still rubbing his hand. I think I'm well-versed in cultures, ranging from both inside and out of the Coalition. She picked up the stick again and smacked it hard against the table, producing the audible sound of a whip as it hits bare skin.
That is what we are here to find out, she announced. Now, I am negotiator Xerxes Alaska. I have negotiated over 400 treaties in the past 70 years, and am single-handedly credited with saving billions of lives. However, they have told me only you can negotiate with the Sill. So I am to impart my knowledge onto you. I hope you are a quick study, because we will need you to absorb 70 years' worth of experience in only 30 days.
70 years? The woman didn't look a day over 40. Maybe time worked differently on Vallis. Pleasure to meet you, Cass said, doing his best to keep the sarcasm out of his voice, and failing miserably.
I know,
she said, looking down on him across the bridge of her nose.
I do not need to hear your qualifications or your experience. I have already extensively studied your records and have concluded you are a poor choice to make this contact. However, since I am only a negotiator and not an admiral, we will be abiding by their orders. Are you prepared?
Prepared for what? He asked. Smack! Cass withdrew his hand again, seething while sucking in air through his teeth.
To learn,
she snapped. Box stared at the door to their quarters. 6 days. 6 days of the exact same thing. Waiting. Waiting for what? For the ship to explode? For Cass to finally give him permission to leave their quarters? Neither was very likely at the moment. True to his word, Cass had found them better accommodations. This room was much more the size he assumed humans were accustomed to. Box had spent the first day moping after Cass told him he shouldn't leave their quarters until things had calmed down. Evie had filled out a quick evaluation on him without even asking him any questions and sent it off to the admiral before they departed, ensuring Box could remain on board. But she apparently agreed with Cass it was better if Box laid low for a while. Tensions about Cass being on the ship were high, and for some reason Box had to suffer right along with him. Death by association, he supposed. Over the next 3 days, Box appeared not to have moved an inch in protest, not speaking or responding to anyone when he was addressed. At first, it had annoyed the hell out of Cass, as intended, but he'd seemed to have become used to it, even commenting the silence was a nice change of pace for once. Except Cass didn't know what Box did when he was gone. He was off with some negotiator for at least 3 hours out of the day, and now he also had a bridge shift he had to show up to, which gave Box a lot of spare time. And despite having years' worth of net dramas to watch, they'd lost their luster. Without the comfort of the excuse, he needed more. So far, Box had managed to explore 12% of the ship on his own, without tripping any alarms or arousing any suspicion. He treated it as a challenge, much like he had when he'd been piloting the Excuse. If something looked challenging, it made him want to do it more, like sliding the ship into a spot that had less than a centimeter clearance on either side. He chuckled. Cass had hated that. 2 open doorways down, the shower stopped, and Cass appeared in the opening a moment later, drawing Box from his thoughts. "That woman is a menace," he yelled. "Look at this! Look at my hands!" He shoved the backs of his hands toward Box. Red marks covered all of his skin, inflamed from the hot shower. "I have got to figure out how to get that stick away from her. This can't be legal." "Why don't you haggle it away from her? Aren't you supposed to be becoming a master negotiator?" Box's voice was devoid of emotion. He'd tried the silent treatment, which hadn't worked. Now he'd moved on to the emotionless machine treatment. Perhaps that would annoy Cass enough to formally lift his temporary imprisonment. Maybe she needs to lighten up. He headed back to the bathroom. I've never met anyone who is so strict regarding the rules. And let me tell you, there are a lot of rules. Rules like you wouldn't believe. He returned to Box. Did you know when you're in the presence of the Husmus Riza, you are supposed to pass gas as a sign of respect? Box was intrigued and couldn't help a bit of curiosity prompting his response. Are you finding that helpful in preparation for negotiations with the Sill? He asked. No, Cass roared, oblivious to the fact Box had shown the first emotion in days. Nothing has helped so far. It's because no one knows anything about the Sill except how destructive their weapons are. The net result of all these classes, he used the air quotes, serves no purpose other than to keep me busy and out of everyone's way on this ship. How much trouble can I get into when I can barely use my hands? It's a conspiracy, he said. Like our quarters situation? Box asked. Yes. Evie told me she is sure Paige was the one who assigned us the closet, but she doesn't have any direct evidence. Which I should have guessed had I known he was good enough to break into the requisitions database and change our assignments. Or find someone else who hates you as much as he does. It's much simpler, Box replied. I don't know, Cass said, dropping his arms. He returned to the bathroom, taking off his towel as he did, and giving Box a perfect view of his ass. Box was about to make a remark, but refrained. He had to remember, emotionless machine. That's how the people on the ship wanted to treat him, so that's how he would act. I'm off to the Ursanomium mines again, Cass announced after a few moments, having slipped on a clean set of clothes and boots. A coalition uniform had been delivered to their quarters 2 days prior, when Box had just returned from a jaunt. A lucky coincidence he'd been inside when the delivery arrived. Otherwise, they would have no doubt asked Cass why he'd scheduled the delivery when no one was inside. But that uniform had remained untouched ever since, hanging in the back of the closet. Box wasn't about to open that can of wasps, but instead admired Cass for not conforming to what was expected of him. Box made no motion to indicate he'd heard Cass, other than raising his right hand 10 centimeters before lowering it again. Have fun doing whatever it is you're doing today, Cass added. I'll talk to Evie again after I'm done with my bridge shift to see if she thinks it's okay for you to move around the ship again. Box couldn't help but feel some guilt at his deception. But he wasn't about to tell Cass now, not when he still had 88% of the ship to explore. Some areas would be much more challenging than others, but he welcomed the risk. "Thank you," was all he said in that same emotionless tone. Cass stood in the doorway, staring at him a moment longer than made Box comfortable. Then he turned, and the door slipped closed. Box stood, walking over to the closet holding the uniform. He stared at it long enough until he was sure Cass would be far enough away not to spot him leaving the room. Box turned and walked right out the door. 13. The halls were quiet this morning. It seemed most people were on duty. Box hadn't experienced a full week on the ship yet, so some of the schedules were still foreign to him. But he had plenty of time to learn. According to the most recent estimates, they were a good 25 days from Sill space, and 25 days was an eternity for exploration, though he was still figuring out how he'd get into the weapons lab. He'd be noticed there, or any sensitive area of the ship, really, but he was determined to see all of it. Box had known the reasonable excuse inside and out, and hoped to form a similar bond with Tempest. Perhaps today would be a good day to visit engineering. During their last mission, Cass had spoken of the Claxion station on board who worked down there, which was what helped Tempest generate its tremendous speed. Yes, that was something Box would like to see for himself, despite the risk. The weapons lab could wait, perhaps on the return trip. Box took the hypervator down 7 more levels to 14, stepping out into another empty hallway. His luck held. A few times he'd had to make up some excuse about running an errand for someone or having programmed in the wrong coordinates for his destination. Usually no one paid him any mind, though a few regarded him with skepticism. He'd filed their names for later. As he turned the corner, he caught the movement of someone down the hall to his left, speaking in a loud and jovial manner. He pulled back, shuffling across the intersection into the far side, while listening to the voice grow closer. "Isn't a big deal. I told Green I'd be happy to pilot, but he didn't want to lose one of his best." Box recognized that voice. It was Rond again, no doubt bragging about his piloting skills. Maybe if he challenged Box to a flying competition instead of trying to best him with a logic test, he might have learned something. As it was, Box didn't want Ron to catch him down here. The lieutenant would know something was wrong immediately and report him. "He didn't say that, did he? You're embellishing," the other voice, female, said. Box didn't recognize her from his copy of the crew manifest. "He might have hinted at it. I'm just telling you what I heard," Ron chuckled. Box took off down the hall, his metal feet loud against the floor panels. He couldn't stay out here. Ron would find him, for sure. Box turned to the right and entered the first door that opened for him. Inside was a large room full of beds, equipment, and people moving all about. He'd accidentally entered sickbay. One of the nurses glanced up, did a double take, then returned to her duties, apparently sure robots couldn't need any services they would provide. Box couldn't stay here. Someone would report him for sure. As he turned to leave, someone came up beside him. "May I help you?" a new voice asked. Box turned to find himself face to face with the ship's doctor, Zax. "I believe I am lost," Box replied in his monotone, doing his best to conceal his panic. "You're Mr. Robeaux's artificial life form, correct?" Zax asked. Box had to do everything he could to tamp down his fury. "Yes," he said in the same monotone. "I was told you are more than most other machines. You have what the humans call a soul. Would you say that's accurate?" Conflicted, he remained silent. How was he supposed to respond? "Yes, I'm an autonomous being. Cut me open and study me, please." Or, "No, I am like everyone else. Nothing special at all." The tension of it was killing him. I am just a machine, he eventually said. Zax stared at him through 6 black eyes positioned in 2 columns running down Zax's face, each with an aquamarine center that could rival even the most beautiful of galaxies. I don't believe that is true, she whispered. But if it's what you want to believe, who am I to tell you any different? Box regarded the doctor, unsure of what to make of the Yaxinax. He'd met a few before in the Sargan Commonwealth, though they were usually trading information or working off a debt. Poor souls who, like Cass, had been ejected or otherwise found themselves outside the protection of the Coalition. The one thing all Yaxinax had in common, though, was that they had complex mating structures, a prospect that had only increased Box's fascination with biological reproduction. This might be his one chance to learn more from an actual source instead of second-hand knowledge from the ship's library, or even worse, hearsay. Would you like a tour of our facility? Zax offered. Perhaps it will add to your knowledge base in a significant or meaningful way. Box stammered, unsure why the doctor was being so accommodating. Yes, please. Zax's small mouth stretched into a smile. I understand Yaxinax do not have genders, Box said. At least not binary ones. This is true. My species has developed over many thousands of years the ability to reproduce with one or many partners. Any of the involved parties can carry the child, or children, and in some cases, each member of the bonded unit will carry a fetus to term. However, I realize being on a Coalition ship filled with species that are binary, this is out of the norm. If you need to refer to me, it is easiest to use she pronouns. Thank you, Box said, losing even more of the monotone. He was already fascinated by Zax and only wanted to know more. It was as if he had stumbled on a gold mine. Not to mention, with a tour, he could check off all of sickbay on his exploration chart. Follow me this way, Zax said, her long, slender body moving through the space effortlessly. Here we have the examination beds and tables for minor injuries. Along the wall were 12 different tables that could fold into a chair or flat into a bed if necessary. All of our scanning equipment is the best in the Coalition. I made sure of that when I came aboard as Chief Medical Officer. Zax led Box to another section while the nurses moved around them, paying neither of them any attention. And here we have the surgical bay. My team and I can perform up to 7 surgical procedures at once, if necessary. And on a starship, you never know what you will need to repair. I'm sure you've seen your fair share of scrapes and bruises, if you'll pardon the term. I have been injured in the past, Box replied, thinking of the time he and Cass had to chase down a Sargan defector who happened to be an excellent bomb maker. Box had lost half his appendages that day, though Cass had him back up and working in perfect order, not more than 60 hours later. Despite the fact it doesn't technically fall under the purview of medical science, I have also studied a fair bit of mechanics to tend to you or any of the drone's needs, should the occasion arrive. She leaned in close. Personally, I don't always trust the engineers to get it right. 3 of her eyes winked at once. Box blinked rapidly, staring at the doctor in disbelief. You studied for me? Zax smiled and lifted 2 of her 4 arms up, as if to say, it was no trouble. Yaxinax are curious, and we can retain great volumes of information, she said. I figured I had some extra space in my head, so why not? You are a member of the crew, after all. That's debatable, Box said, losing any last remnants of camouflage. Perhaps Zax was someone he could trust, after all. Not to me. She turned to continue the tour. Back here, we have our morgue. Zax pointed to the far wall in the adjacent room, which has remained mostly empty so far. Thankfully. It means my team and I are doing our jobs. Box had a flash of memory of the ensign on the bridge who'd been impaled by a large piece of the bulkhead that had buckled in their battle with the Sargans. He didn't want to bring it up to Zax, but an image of the ensign's slack face kept replaying in his mind, her dead, empty eyes staring into space. And here is our science division, where we research, cultivate, and study new and interesting ways to help people. Zax held one of her arms out to the people in the next room. It was stark white, and each member of the staff wore dust-repellent garments. A low-level force barrier separated the clean room from the rest of sickbay. And finally, we have our disease storage unit. In here, we keep over 500,000 diseases from 300 different planets. Box, despite not being able to catch a biological virus, stepped back. Why would you keep those? Because, most often, the best cure for a disease is the mutation of a similar disease. Most coalition ships don't have a collection this large, but that's because many of these are from my personal stores. It never hurts to be prepared. And what happens if one of those containers breaks? Box asked, staring at the wall of vials. The system locks down and incinerates the vial at over 5,000 kelvins. In the unlikely event the entire set is in danger, it will all be destroyed, which would be such a shame. Box, intrigued, leaned in closer. I never knew coalition ships had these on board. It isn't a secret, Zack said, but it's also not common knowledge. Most people don't want to know about it, but as long as the captain knows, we're fine. We're not violating any coalition laws here. And I have to admit, I really hope this encounter with the Sill goes well. I'm hoping to add some Sill diseases to my collection. She turned back to Box. Your friend Caspian, he's the one who is supposed to make contact? Box nodded. He doesn't think it will go well. Sax pursed her tiny lips and led Box back into the main sickbay. Box found it soothing. A soft bluish light filled the room. He wouldn't mind spending more time here, if he could. Thank you for the tour, he said, for once genuinely grateful to someone. Why don't you come back tomorrow, she said. There's always plenty to learn here, and we have the most extensive database in the Coalition on biological processes. I'd be happy to show you. That is, assuming we're not under attack, or finding our way out of a wormhole, or whatever it is they do up there on the bridge. If Box could have smiled, he would have. As it was, he just blinked his eyes rapidly. Did that mean he wouldn't be reported after all? It's not a problem? He asked. Zack shook her head. Absolutely not. I think you'll find medical personnel some of the most empathetic and caring people on this ship. You have nothing to worry about. It was as if she could read his mind. Box couldn't help all his processors from firing at once. Yes, I'd like that, he said, with as little enthusiasm as he could muster, though a lot still came through in his words. Zax smiled in response, and Box decided he liked her smile. He liked it a lot. 14. The doors to the main bridge hypervator slid open, revealing third shift. Cass muttered a silent, "Thank Core," into the ether as he stood from his specialist station, which still had only been given the barest of functionality for his access codes, and made his way past his counterpart, who would take over for the next shift. Along with third shift came Joro Page, whose shoulder collided with Cass's as they passed each other. Cass thought to shove the man, beat his face in until it was pulp, and laugh over his unconscious body. Instead, he didn't even give him the satisfaction of having been inconvenienced, only made his way to the hypervator with the rest of the shift. Inside the crowded hypervator, Zahl moved next to him, the hard light face smiling its somewhat unnatural grin. "Exciting day today, don't you think?" he asked. "If you call a stellar nursery 500 million kilometers away exciting, then yeah." Cass wanted to do nothing more than to sleep for the next 14 hours. On an average day, he would have been more than interested in the nursery. But class with Laska this morning had been rough. The backs of his hands had throbbed all day. He had half a mind to go down to sickbay for some ointment. Except Laska would know he would have done it, and he didn't want to give the witch the satisfaction. He noticed how she eyed his swollen hands each morning, as if they were a rite of passage for him. "I do, though I wish we could have stopped to take a look. I'm sure the Coalition will send a research or survey ship to come and study the phenomenon. Zahl turned back to the front. We are still on for dinner this evening? Fuck. He'd forgotten all about the dinner he'd agreed to weeks ago. What he really wanted was a good stiff drink. But Laska had put an end to that when he'd shown up to her class hungover last week. She'd had all his bar privileges revoked until after the mission was over. But after, it wouldn't matter, because they'd all be a bunch of corpses floating in space. Cass felt the eyes of the rest of second shift on them in the small space. Did these people not have lives of their own? Tonight? I thought, I am making a human delicacy, smoked brisket of yarn, smothered in a whiskey glaze. Cass's mouth watered at the very prospect. He'd been eating nothing but the mess hall food for weeks now. How could he say no to that, no matter how weird Zahl's quarters were? Yes, I'll be there. The hypervator stopped, letting 3 of the crew off. Zahl, Cass, and 2 others remained. Excellent, Zahl said in his most threatening voice. I very much look forward to it, and learning more about you. The hypervator stopped again, and Zahl stepped off. Don't forget, 1,500 hours. I won't, Cass replied. The door slid closed again, and Cass caught one of the ensigns staring. The ensign's eyes found the floor as soon as he was caught. Something you want to say? No, the ensign replied. Nothing at all. Evie was right. Maybe he should have kept his commission. How are things for you these days? Cass asked, buttoning his shirt. Asking out of guilt or genuine concern, Box replied. His attention seemed like it wasn't all there. What kind of a question is that? Of course I'm concerned. You sit in this room all day, despite having all your privileges returned. You can go to any non-secure part of the ship if you want. Why would I want that? My home is right here, in my chair, Box replied, his face not moving. Fine. Be an asshole. I'm just trying to make sure you're doing okay. I noticed you haven't asked the same of me. He finished the buttons and smoothed the wrinkles on the front. It would have to do. That's because I don't care, Box replied. I'll sit here like a good little bot and keep to myself, like I'm supposed to. Hey, Cass replied, suddenly hot. It isn't my fault. On our first day on this ship, you nearly took the head off one of the lieutenants. There are consequences for your actions. I didn't impose them, but we're not in the Commonwealth anymore. We can't go around doing what we like. You seem to be doing what you like just fine, he replied. You call getting beaten every morning and falling asleep at a bridge station every afternoon doing what I like? All the while, we're only getting closer to what I know will not end well. You're such a baby. At least you get to be on the bridge, Box said. And you get to go to fancy dinners. Cass sighed, exasperated. You want to go? No one's stopping you. Why don't you come along if you want to talk to someone for the bridge so badly? Box hesitated. What was going on behind those blinking yellow eyes? He'd been acting strange ever since they'd come on board, and Cass couldn't help but think there might be something seriously wrong with him. I'm fine here. If you're lonely, take Commander Diazol, he said. Cass's mouth turned into a frown. Why hadn't he thought of that? Because of their schedules, they hadn't seen much of each other the past few weeks. He tapped the comm on his arm. Zahl? Yes, Caspian? The Unterburo's voice came over the comm, heavy as ever. Would you mind if I brought a guest? Please, bring whomever you wish, he replied. I have more than enough for everyone. Thanks. I'll be there soon. Cass cut the comm and let out a breath. He felt better already. Does the commander know she's going? Or are you just going to show up on her doorstep with flowers? Box asked. Shut up, Cass replied, tapping his comm again. Evie? Cass?
Is everything okay? She asked over the comm, her voice wavering.
Yes. It's just I have this invitation by Zahl to eat, and I need a wing woman. She chuckled on the other end.
Zahl's famous dinners. He only does it for people he really likes. When is it?
15 minutes, Cass said sheepishly. He could imagine her shaking her head at him.
It beats the dinner I had planned for myself, she said. I'll meet you over there.
Wow, that was easy, Cass said after he cut the comm.
I can't wait to see what your kids look like,
Box replied, his eyes blinking in a slow rhythm. That meant he was focused on something important. But whatever it was must be in his databanks. He stared into space, seeing something Cass couldn't. For the 1000th time, it's not like that, he replied.
So you say. But I'm becoming an expert on biological relationships, Box stated. I know what I'm talking about.
Cass shook his head, inspecting himself one last time in the mirror. Box was about as good at predicting relationships as he was at small talk. Thoughts?
I would say you look like shit, but even shit has its good days, Box replied, his eyes laughing for him.
Whatever. Enjoy your evening. Cass stepped out into the hallway. Normally, Box wasn't so combative and edgy. Cass had thought it had been the confinement, but as soon as it had been lifted, Box had still refused to leave the room. Instead, he seemed to pass the time analyzing what? Should he have insisted Box stay back on 8, where he wouldn't be under as much scrutiny, and where he had greater autonomy? No. At some point, someone would have said the wrong thing and set him off. But that one room was too cramped for him. What he really needed was his own place. Evie had said there was plenty of room. So why was he still staying with Cass? It wasn't like he needed a babysitter. He'd bring it up to Evie after dinner. After taking the hypervator to Zahl's floor, Cass turned the corner to see Evie already outside the door, leaning up against the wall in much the same way she had when he'd spotted her that day at Devil's Gate. Not going to shove a blade up under my neck today, are you? He smiled as he approached. What? It took her a moment to remember. Oh, no, she chuckled and glanced at his hands. She's a taskmaster, huh? She motioned to the welts. Don't even get me started. I think she's pissed I'm the one to talk to the Sill, and not her. But I can't prove it yet. If nothing else, my long-term goal is to get that stick from her and toss it out an airlock. Evie suppressed a laugh as Cass pushed the small button beside Zahl's door. Enter, his ominous voice said. Cass exchanged a smile with Evie. Zahl could make a killing shooting propaganda commercials. He'd been expecting what exactly? That Zahl would transform his quarters into a replica of his own home planet? That it would be hot and dark and full of smoke and soot? However, when Cass stepped into the otherwise normal room, he felt somewhat silly. It was no different than his own quarters, with the only exception being that what looked like a track suspended from the ceiling skirted the walls until it made a complete loop. Welcome, Zahl said, setting some plates on the wide table in the middle of his dining room, which was off to the side of the kitchen. Along the back wall were a series of windows that showed the field of stars blurring by in the distance. Commander, nice to see you again.
Lieutenant, Evie replied. Thanks for allowing me to crash. You know I can't resist your meals.
She turned to Cass.
Zahl is known to be better than some of the cooks down in the mess hall. Half the crew would love to be sitting in your shoes at the moment.
Cass turned to Zahl. I didn't realize. Thank you for inviting me. Zahl's hard-light avatar smiled. You're welcome. The cooks only need to take the time to learn more about the cultures they serve food to. Once they understand how they can work in conjunction with each other, it makes the dining experience much more pleasant. Will you be, I know. Cass wasn't sure how to finish the sentence he'd started. The last thing he wanted was to be rude to his host. Then he'd be known as the man who'd screwed up one of the most coveted dinners on the ship, like he needed something else on his plate. "This apparatus allows me to consume foods through the hands," Zahl replied, "though they have to be in a less than solid state when they reach me. Please, make yourselves at home while I finish." Evie took a seat and tapped her comm, bringing up a 3D display emanating from the device. "If you'll excuse me a moment, I need to finish some work. I won't be a minute." Cass, meanwhile, took a short stroll around the space. An open doorway led to the next room over, which, instead of a bed, sat a large pile of obsidian and volcanic rocks, all arranged in the shape of a small mountain. "My altar," Zahl said, "for when I disengage from my apparatus." "How often do you, Cass asked, doing his best not to trip over his words. "I can stay inside for over 3 weeks if necessary. But I take it off every evening to relax. I will go to my altar and pray, then take my respite." It didn't look like any altar Cass had ever seen. But then again, the Untuburu had their own specific customs regarding religion, many of which were followed to the letter. Laska had drilled that into his head last week, despite Cass already knowing much about the Untuburu culture. He pointed up. "What's the track?" "Because I spend so much time with the apparatus, my body can grow weak. Once a week, I will disengage and spend hours doing laps to keep up my stamina. It provides for most of my exercise needs." "Why not use the gym down on level 12? He asked. "Most humanoid species aren't comfortable with my natural form, especially not as I scurry around the gym." He finished setting the places at the table. "But we're here to talk about you. If you'll please take your seat, we'll pray before we begin." Cass couldn't help keep that shiver creeping up his spine. Zahl made it sound like he was sitting down to a sacrifice, not dinner. But he took a seat anyway, as Evie shut off her comm. "If you will please raise your hands," Zahl said, raising his own high above his head. The sleeves of the velvet robe fell back, revealing the metallic musculature of the apparatus he wore. He bent his head back toward the ceiling and closed his eyes. Cass and Evie followed suit. This really was a sacrifice. "Great Core, the All-Knowing, you bless us with life, you bless us with death. May this meal assist us on our journey to your open embrace. Help us seek balance and unity with the universe." Never a religious person, Cass couldn't help but reflect on the simplicity of the prayer. He cracked an eyelid to see Zahl lowering his hands, which he and Evie mimicked. Once his hands were on the table, Zahl reached out to Evie and Cass. They each took a hand and took each other's. Cass couldn't help but think how cold Zahl's hand was. "All things in balance. Thank you, Core," Zahl said. "All things in balance," Evie repeated. "All things in balance," Cass said, assuming it was the right thing to do. Zahl released their hands. "Thank you for indulging me. I know it isn't for everyone." "It was beautiful," Evie replied. Cass couldn't agree more. "Please," Zahl said, "eat." 15. "So, you believe the Coalition is inherently flawed, like a diamond with a crack embedded somewhere inside. It still looks beautiful, but one day that crack will tear the jewel in two," Zahl said. "I don't know if I'd call it a diamond," Cass said, exchanging looks with Evie, "but it certainly has cracks." "This is absolutely fascinating," Zahl said. "I can't decide if your prejudice against the Coalition is because of their unfair treatment of you, or if you believe there are problems within the system itself that need to be corrected." "Trust me," Cass said, taking a mouthful of yarn. "It's not prejudice," though it came out as He's not prejudiced.
Oh, for the love of... Chew with your mouth closed, Evie said, her nose upturned.
I'll have to challenge you on that, Zahl said. Because of your treatment, by its very nature, invites you to be biased. How can we know you are thinking with a clear head?
Cass swallowed. Because now I'm no longer under the brainwashing of the system. I can see it for what it really is.
Then you are saying the commander and I are brainwashed? That we do not see what is obvious to you? Zahl asked.
Evie only shook her head. Evie knows what's going on. But before, yeah, she was. Before she knew Rutledge had betrayed me and covered up a crime which, mind you, is outlawed in the Coalition's laws of governance. Cass, maybe we shouldn't be talking about classified, she offered. Oh, no. We've opened up this can, and we're getting to the bottom of it, Cass said. He was treading on shaky ground. The real story behind what had happened with the Atlas and Rutledge wasn't generally known. Rutledge had been arrested on charges other than conspiracy, and the tragedy of the Atlas had been framed as the Coalition making a sacrifice to keep the ship out of Sargan hands. And while that was true, the real reason it had been destroyed was Cass. If that weapon had gotten out in any way, there would have been no telling how it would have changed the balance of power. Zahl only stared at him with a serene smile plastered on his face. And maybe the Unterbrühl wine was loosening his lips, but Cass wasn't about to let this opportunity go. He pointed at Zahl with his utensil. I can tell you right now, the corruption goes to the very top. Zahl turned to Evie.
Commander, has this been your experience as well? He asked. Do you find the Coalition rife with corruption?
No, she said, sneering at Cass. I'll admit what Cass went through was unfair and horrific, but outside the norm of standard Coalition operating procedure. You can't condemn the entire Coalition for the actions of a few individuals.
Oh, come on, Evie, Cass said, leaning his elbow on the table and staring at her. You can't tell me you really think it began and ended with Rutledge. Someone had to authorize his missions, procure resources, make allotments.
Yes, she said. Admiral Sangvi, the ranking officer in this quadrant. He told us as much.
Her eyes flicked to Zahl, and it didn't escape Cass's notice her hand had balled into a fist. Then doesn't it follow that Rutledge's orders to complete the mission, no matter what, would have also come from Sangvi? Or someone else even higher up? Say the head of Coalition Security? Someone else gave him clearance. Otherwise, he never would have taken the risk.
Evie shot him a stern look that said, Shut up, or I'm going to retrieve my sword and impale you.
Maybe he should impress his luck. I was under the impression Admiral Rutledge had been arrested because he disobeyed a direct order. But this wouldn't have anything to do with our current mission, would it? Zahl asked. I've heard rumors Rutledge was arrested and imprisoned for charges unrelated to his actual conduct.
Evie's utensil clattered to the plate. Where did you hear that?
So then it is true, Zahl replied. I got the information from one of the security officers on Starbase 8. He heard it from the prosecutor.
Hearsay, Evie said, and you're under strict orders not to discuss what you know with anyone.
Of course, Commander, Zahl said.
He reached out, and the flesh of the heartlight disappeared, replaced instead by a metal skeleton. In the center was a port that opened, which Zahl placed over the yarn as it sucked it up. Cass could see the food move through a semi-transparent tube embedded inside the exoskeleton, which disappeared under his robe.
I have to admit, I'm as good a cook as everyone says.
Is that how you eat everything? Cass asked.
When I have company, or am in the presence of others, yes, Zahl replied.
Evie pushed back from the table. Thank you for the meal, Zahl, but Cass and I have some duties to attend to. She yanked his chair back, pulling him away from the table.
I at least hope you enjoyed the food, Zahl said, standing just as Cass did. I look forward to another meeting in the future. Mr. Robeaux, you have been fascinating.
Thank you, Cass said, unsure of what was happening. He hadn't even finished his yarn yet. Evie led him to the door and gave him a little shove to the other side before turning back to Zahl.
Next time I'll host, she said. Good night, Lieutenant. Good night, Commander, Zahl said as the door shut. Are you insane? Evie whispered to Cass as they made their way down the hall. Cass wobbled. What? He asked. I don't know. Maybe all the classified information you spilled in there? No one is supposed to know about Rutledge. Certainly not a non-human species. What if he mentions it to someone on his home planet, and they happen to be a member of the fleet or the infantry? Then they start investigating why they haven't heard about this from Coalition brass. You can't just go around spouting whatever you want. There are But it happened. To me, Cass replied. Shouldn't people know? Or is the Coalition going to cover it up forever? What happens when these aliens show up and we have superweapons to fight them? Don't you think people will start questioning that? That's not our problem or our priority right now. Our orders are to keep quiet about Rutledge and the Atlas. She held up her hands in defense. I know he wronged you, but you're going to have to keep that close to the chest. At least for now. There's no other way. He wasn't sure if she was being intentionally obtuse, or if she really did believe Rutledge had been working alone. Regardless, he couldn't keep quiet about this forever, not if the Coalition had any hope of surviving. Thwack! Cass jerked up, his eyes going wide. No daydreaming, Laska ordered, or next time it's the knuckles. I think I've evolved an immunity, Cass said, staring at his hands. He'd managed to cut down on the smacking, though he'd needed to be vigilant, and today he wasn't at the top of his game. That's not how evolution works, Laska said, returning to the desk and climbing a step she'd placed behind it to stare down on him. We are due to reach Sill space tomorrow. Give me the 8 tenets of diplomacy. Cass sighed, knowing none of this would do them any good. The Sill weren't interested in talking. Be patient, understand the other side, leave avenues open to retreat, seek united ground, be realistic, protect your interests, don't force the issue. Laska narrowed her eyes, stepping down from her perch and approaching Cass, her stick bobbing up and down as she walked. His eyes went to the instrument of pain as he racked his memory for the last one. Serve the common interest, he said, louder than he meant to. Very good, Laska purred. What is your strategy for initiating first contact? Establish myself and my connection to the Sill, inform them of my intentions, and invite them to a dialogue. And if that fails? The weapon bobbed even quicker behind her back. Gauge their response, adjust my strategy accordingly. His knuckles were white under the small table. The few times he tried to hide his hands, he'd been rewarded with a smack above the ear instead, which hurt infinitely more. He replaced his hands at the desk, despite knowing he was right. I suppose it will do, Laska said, her small eyes dropping. I had hoped you'd lean into this better, but I can only do so much with the raw material. There has to be some potential there to begin with. I appreciate the vote of confidence, Cass replied. Thwack! Damn it, he yelled, pulling his hand back and rubbing the knuckles. No backtalk, Laska said. I will accompany you to the bridge tomorrow to ensure you are performing to your best ability. Oh, hell no. Even if she put in the request, Cass would make sure Evie quashed it. Negotiator Xerxes, he said, using her name for the first time. She stiffened and looked as though she might give him another smack for good measure. I needed a level with me. If you were in my position, do you think this negotiation would have a chance? Far better people than me have tried to build a relationship with the Sill, and every single one of them has failed. Her eyes softened. I believe dialogue is possible between all civilized species. Whether the Sill are civilized remains to be seen. But often, diplomacy is more about what isn't said than what is. They have to know you understand their beliefs and fears, and you must trust they understand the same. It's always a two-way street.
which means there are twice as many opportunities for someone to veer off the road and wreck.
He took a deep breath, rubbing the back of his hand.
You aren't the best I have ever worked with, but you aren't the worst either, she added.
He wasn't sure if that was supposed to make him feel better or not. She pulled out a data pad and checked the front.
But now it's time to adjourn. We have a meeting with the captain to go over our strategy.
16.
All hands to battle stations. We are approaching Sill space.
Captain, to the bridge, Evie announced, watching her indicator on the arm of the chair, while at the same time keeping an eye on the view screen. They approached the invisible barrier separating non-aligned space from Sill territory, and her heart threatened to burst from her chest. Not that she let it show. She'd always had a calm and practiced demeanor, which was even more important on a coalition ship for times just like this. If the younger officers saw her sweat, then they might be apt to make a mistake. Both she and the captain needed to project calm, but with authority. The command room door slid open, revealing Green, who took a seat beside her as the rest of the first shift came on board to replace the more inexperienced officers. Among them was Cass, who remained at the back of the bridge, watching without taking the specialist's seat.
Mr. Robeaux, what can we expect in there?
Green indicated the screen ahead of them. I expect we'll be stopped quickly. They'll have proximity sensors on their border, letting them know when it has been crossed. The sensors weren't always there, but were installed after the war. They learned they couldn't trust the coalition wouldn't just come barging in one day. Evie watched him. His eyes were sunken in, and he hadn't shaved in days, despite the fact he had assured her he was getting plenty of sleep. He wasn't used to a coalition schedule. It took some getting used to, what with the days being 20 hours. The Sargans maintained a 24-hour day, and living among them for 5 years, he had undoubtedly become accustomed to it. She'd heard long ago humans were born with a natural 25-hour cycle as babies, and adjusting took some getting used to. He also couldn't take a nap whenever he wanted to either. She should have ordered Laska to go easier on him, to allow him to rest more, since the entire mission hinged on his ability to perform under pressure. It wasn't good he was starting out tired.
6 minutes to the border,
Ensign River announced from the navigation position. She'd done a good job taking over for Ensign Blackburn. These last few weeks of relative calm had given her some good experience. Evie hoped it was enough, because from here on out, there was no telling what they would be encountering.
Raise the armor and prepare all weapons, Green said. But I want them set on non-lethal shots only.
He turned to Evie.
As if they could do any damage anyway.
Aye, sir, Page said from Tactical. Captain, Cass said, stepping forward. Keep the armor, but lose the weapons. They won't like that.
Are you sure?
Green asked.
I don't like going in there defenseless.
It wouldn't matter anyway. Our weapons do nothing to their shield systems, and flying in with our guns up and asses out is a good way to send the wrong message. Evie caught a sneer from Page, but he kept his eyes on his own station. It had only taken running a few reports to figure out it had been Page who'd arranged for Cass to live in a closet for his reintroduction to the ship. Some kind of practical joke, though she hadn't confronted him about it yet. She wanted to wait until they were on the back end of this mission. But he acted like he didn't even care if he got caught. Evie couldn't figure out why he was more ambivalent toward Cass than anyone else, though she'd also seen Rond exhibiting some odd behavior around him. And of course, Rond had been the one who had reported Box to the admiral.
Lieutenant, disarm all weapons. If they scan us, I don't want them to get the wrong impression, Green said.
Page swiveled in his seat. But that will leave us completely unprepared if they decide to attack, he protested. How can we...
Lieutenant,
Green said, his voice a low rumble. Page turned back to his console and dropped the weapons.
3 minutes to the border,
River announced.
Any sign of Sill ships patrolling on scanners?
Green asked, watching the screen. There was nothing out there but stars, as far as Evie could see. Nothing yet, Captain, Zahl replied. I have the scanners extended to full range.
Ship readiness report,
Evie asked, running down her mental checklist before heading into a potentially dangerous situation. All stations report ready. The crew is prepped, and the space wings are on standby, Zahl said. They wouldn't have the short-range fighters set to launch on a diplomatic mission, but this was anything but ordinary.
Should we drop out of the undercurrent?
Blum asked. Green turned to Cass.
Thoughts?
Cass exchanged glances with Evie. I don't see any reason to drop out until it's necessary.
Helm, adjust our heading to skirt the edge of Sill territory. If we get into trouble out here, I want to get out of their space as quickly as possible, Green said.
2 minutes.
Cass took a seat in the specialist station as the inky blackness of Sill space stretched before them.
There's a system before we get to Quaval, Cass said, inside Sill territory. It's full of super-heavy gas giants and could make a good place for refuge if we need it. Send the coordinates to the helm. We'll keep that in our back pocket, Green said.
Evie kept her eyes trained on her own display, showing summary readouts from each station. She took 3 deep breaths in succession.
Here we go. Crossing the barrier now, Captain, River said.
The rest of the bridge was silent, except for the constant hum of the engines. Evie couldn't even hear anyone else breathing. It had all come down to this.
Steady, Helm, Green said.
Evie thought she saw Ron's handshake as he held the ship in a straight line. She stood and went over to his station.
You've got this, Isaac, she whispered.
He nodded, but he kept his focus on his job. Evie turned to watch the rest of the crew. They may have their flaws, but they were a good crew, and they worked well together. The only one who seemed unperturbed by the intensity of the situation was Zahl, who wore the same smile he'd had the night they'd had dinner. It was hard to believe that had been over a week since. The ship rocked as if it had been hit by an earthquake, throwing Evie from where she'd been standing clear across the bridge where she collided with the bulkhead. She put her arms up in time to keep her head from smashing into the metal. Her left arm snapped with astonishing little pain. She could still function.
Evasive action! Restraints! Green shouted. We've been thrown from the undercurrent,
River called out as the auto restraints pulled her back into her chair, as they did for each crew member, save Evie.
They hit us from inside.
Evie could feel the dampener straining as the ship spun out from the undercurrent into normal space. She could only pray they didn't have the terrible luck to come out next to a star or other heavenly body. But thankfully, most of space was empty, which gave them good odds. She pushed against the bulkhead, struggling to stand up.
Open the comm,
Green yelled, staring at the screen ahead of them. Evie froze. 2 large Sill vessels, which to her resembled sharp claws hanging in space, faced them. Though it was hard to tell which side was the front, she could only assume they were facing them. She'd seen long-range scans of ships like these, but seeing them in person drove a fear through her she didn't think possible. She held her arm tighter, willing the sensation to return as it had gone numb.
Open,
Zahl replied, the smile having turned into a frown on his face.
Sill vessels, halt your attack. We are a peace-seeking vessel from the Sovereign Coalition of Aligned Systems.
The ship shook again, sending a rumble through the room. Though as far as she could tell, they hadn't fired any kind of weapon, energy or otherwise. Evie finally got to her feet in time to see Cass making his way over to her.
We're getting no response, Captain, Zahl replied.
Keep the channel open, Cass yelled, supporting himself against the wall. Zahl nodded. Sill vessel? 7 years ago. The ship shook again, sending Cass to the floor and cutting him off.
We have a breach on deck 4, Zahl said.
The room shook again, producing a loud bang from somewhere, and Evie had only the briefest thought to hope it wasn't an overload on the power systems.
Engineering is reporting the drive is becoming unstable, Blum said. Another hit or two, and we'll be gone, Page added. Captain, we have to retreat. Green turned to Blom. Get the engines back and open up an undercurrent. Helm, about face. Get us out of here as quickly as possible. Captain, Cass called, trying to stand again. Cass, Evie shook her head. There was nothing they could do unless they wanted to be destroyed. Undercurrent charted, River announced, her voice shaky. Helm, go, Green yelled. There was a lurch forward as the dampeners struggled to keep up with the ship, nearly sending Evie to the ground again. She glanced over at Cass, who only stared at the screen. The two Sill ships disappeared behind them as they traversed the undercurrent. How long until we're out of their space? 45 seconds, sir, River replied. Blom, push it. Give me everything they've got in engineering. She nodded, relaying the commands to the lower decks. Evie made it back to her chair to monitor the situation. Ops, did you get a good scan of those ships? She asked. Zahl shook his head. Not much. Our scanners couldn't get past their armor. According to the information provided by Admiral Sangvi, these ships were much more advanced than the one the Atlas captured. We're clear of their space, Rivers said, producing a loud exhale. Give them a wide berth, and get us far outside their territory. I don't want to even look like we're close, Green said. Aye, Captain. Commander Sester is reporting the undercurrent generators are damaged. If we stay in here too long, the current will collapse and crush us, Blum said. Green stood, checking his own station for the damage reports. How long can we sustain it? Another 10 minutes, tops, she replied. Then we'll have to shut down for repairs. Can we use that gas giant system Robeaux mentioned? Green asked. It's too far away. But there's a binary star system close. Heavy iron content with thousands of planetoids, Ensign Rivers said before Cass could open his mouth. It isn't perfect, but it could provide some cover. Set course, Green said. Ront nodded, adjusting the direction of the ship. Any sign of pursuit? None, Page replied. And I'd like to suggest locking up the traitor until we can properly dispose of him. What? Cass said. What are you talking about? It's obvious you sent them a communication to tell them we were coming. How else could they have found our undercurrent so quickly? We weren't inside their space for more than a minute before they began attacking. I didn't send any message, Cass protested through his teeth. Just like you didn't send the message that got your last ship in trouble, Page said, pointing at him. You better hope no one dies this time. That's enough, Lieutenant, Green snapped. We're not going to turn on each other, not when there are bigger stakes here. He turned to Evie. Commander, get yourself down to sickbay and back as soon as you can. Evie hated leaving her post in the middle of a crisis, but fixing the arm wouldn't take long, and she couldn't do her job properly with a useless appendage. She locked down her station and, with a wince, headed for the hypervator. At least allow me to confine him to his quarters, Page said, indignant. Evie stopped on her way, spinning to face Page. He's the only one on the ship who might even give us a chance of success. Can't you see that? Or are you too stupid to get that through your head? Evie said. Page, momentarily stunned, only blinked at her. Lieutenant, return to your duties. Commander, sickbay. Now, Green ordered. With a huff, she finally made it to the hypervator, the doors cutting her off from the tension in the room as they closed. Evie passed 2 teams extinguishing fires on the corridors, and one trying to contain a chemical leak close to engineering. She thought about heading directly there to assess the situation, but they probably didn't need her getting in the way. Sester was, no doubt, in control of everything. Plus, she really needed to get her arm repaired. It was the same one she'd injured rescuing Cass the first time. Maybe it hadn't healed correctly. The doors to sickbay opened to reveal 2 people on the examination beds, while Zax moved between the 2 of them, doling out diagnoses as she made her examination. She looked up to Evie, her aquamarine eyes probing. Arm, Evie said, holding it at a slight angle. Over here.
Zax pointed with one of her smaller arms to the bed behind her. She crossed the room and sat on the bed, still holding the arm while she waited for treatment. The other two, Ensign Peters and crewman Olagcha, seemed to be in worse shape than she was. They both worked in engineering. They must be having a hell of a time over there. Once this was over, she would pass by just to make sure there was nothing she could do. As she was staring into space, the images in front of her eyes suddenly coalesced into a figure she recognized. "Box?" she asked, staring over at the far wall where he stood completely still. "What are you doing here?" "You can't see me," Box replied. "I've adjusted my colors to completely blend in with the bulkheads." "I can see you. The eyes give you away." "Damn," he said, dropping his head. "It's always the eyes. I need eyelids." She hopped down from the bed and approached him. "What's going on?" "I got lost," he said, in the least convincing voice she'd ever heard. "He's here to learn," Zax said from behind her. "Box, come over here." Box stepped forward, past Evie, over to Ensign Peters. "These are third-degree burns. See how the flesh is charred and necrotized?" Zax asked. "What sort of treatment would you give him?" "Apply a level 3 dermal analgesic and monitor the response," Box replied. Zax turned to Evie. "He's a quick study. Box, look at the commander's injury and report back to me." Evie returned to the bed, taking a seat. "Does Cass know you're down here?" she asked. His eyes blinked once. "No." "I don't understand. Is this some kind of experiment?" He picked up her arm, probing it with his metal fingers. "Tell me if you feel pain," he replied, his voice low. "It's not an experiment. I've found something here." "Ow! Right there," she said, wincing. Box turned to Zax. "Clean break of the radius. Check for splintering?" he asked. Zax nodded without taking her eyes off Ensign Peters. Box turned back to Evie, taking a scanner from the tray of instruments beside him. "So, is this what you're doing now?" she asked. "Beats banging my head against the wall in our room. Without a ship to fly, I feel off." He ran the scanner over her arm. "You haven't seemed like yourself since you came on board." Gone was the loud-mouthed, rambunctious robot she'd first met. He'd lost some of his oomph. "Is that what Cass thinks you're doing? Staying in the room all day?" "I doubt he'd notice if I was gone when he got there. He's had too much on his mind lately. I'm assuming things didn't go well up there?" He turned back to Zax. "No splintering." "Next steps?" Zax asked. "Reset the bone and inject 2 stitchers." Zax turned to Evie. "He is excellent. I can't believe you had him holed up in a room somewhere. With the captain's permission, I'd like to add him to my staff." This seemed to surprise Box as much as it did Evie. The scanner hung limp at the robot's side as he stared at the Yaxinax doctor. "I'll bring it up with him once we're out of crisis mode," Evie replied. "Hold on to the bed. This will sting." Box set the scanner down. She grabbed the edge of the bed as he held her arm with both hands and made a swift twist. A jolt of pain shot through her, but she bore down and didn't scream. One of the other nurses, Mankel if her memory served her correctly, brought Box a small syringe. "Thanks, Jimmy," Box said. He leaned into Evie. "They treat me so well here. It's weird." She stifled a smile. He put the syringe against her skin and pushed. Evie felt the small prick and had the unnerving sensation of something scurrying through her arm, even though technically you weren't supposed to feel them. "Give them about 10 minutes to repair the bone and try not to put pressure on it for a few hours as they reinforce it. We'll remove them tomorrow," Box said. Zax walked over and inspected Evie's arm. "I assume you need to return to duty." "As soon as possible," she said. "Just take it easy. The stitchers have released a localized painkiller in the area, but you may still experience some numbness. Just don't go punching anyone for a while. And take it easy with that arm. I don't want to see you in here again." Evie smiled, hopping down from the bed. "Thanks, to both of you." She headed for the door. "Don't forget my request." Zach said. She waved as the doors closed behind her. 17. Cass grabbed Rond by the lapel, jerking him forward while he cocked his arm back, fully intending to smash the man's face in. But before he could execute, someone else was on him, pulling him and his arm back. Rond, for his part, looked half terrified and half emboldened, breathing a sigh of relief as Cass was forced to release his lapel. "I knew you were trouble the minute you stepped on this ship," Page said from behind him, dragging Cass backward and away from the junior lieutenant. It hadn't been the smartest move, but at the same time, Cass was tired of all the needling. And after Evie had gone to sickbay and Green retired to the command room to go over the damage reports, both Page and Rond had started in on him and hadn't let up. Rond placed the full blame for Blackburn's death squarely on Cass's shoulders. And it had been the last straw, the admiral collapsing under the weight. But now, he was most likely headed to the brig for threatening an officer. Unless he decided to go all in and shove the back of his elbow into Page's face. As the man held him tighter, pulling him to the other side of the bridge, Cass was seriously considering it, when the hypervator doors opened, revealing Evie. "What the hell?" she asked. "He tried to assault Lieutenant Rond," Page explained, still holding Cass in some kind of strange chokehold which didn't allow him much movement. "Release him," Evie ordered. "Now." "Commander," Page protested. "Don't you have enough to worry about other than playing a bouncer?" Evie said. Page scowled at her, releasing Cass. He took a deep breath. He hadn't realized the man had had him in such a grip. It must have been the adrenaline. "And you," Evie shook her head at Cass, "get down to engineering. They need all the help they can get down there. Where's the captain?" "Going over the damage reports," Zahl said, standing beside his station. When the scuffle began, everyone had jumped to intervene, but Page had been the quickest. "Everyone, back to your stations. We don't have time for this," Evie ordered. Reluctantly, Page returned to tactical. She scowled at Cass. "Don't make me tell you twice." Cass shot a look at Page, who eyed him with an intense hatred like he'd never seen before. Why had he gone for the younger officer, rather than the man who was determined to make his time on the ship a living hell? He didn't look at Evie again, instead made his way to the open hypervator and left the bridge. Cass was lucky to have her on his side. Technically, a move like that should have ended with him in the brig, officer or not. He never would have tolerated behavior like that aboard the Atlas, or any ship he'd served on. Coalition officers were supposed to be civil and work together for a common good. But then again, he wasn't an officer anymore, and the same rules didn't apply. Being back on board was harder than he thought. He'd become so used to living by the skin of his teeth, always on guard. If life in the Sargan Commonwealth did anything for him, it made him much more vigilant. As soon as the hypervator doors opened, he jogged down the hallway to engineering. The massive room was in chaos as soon as he stepped inside. Most of the engineering teams were working on securing the large conduits that ran from the back wall through the space and out toward the generators that kept the undercurrents open and wide enough for the ship to pass through. 2 of them had cracked from the strain. Cass had seen a similar problem when the Atlas had burned her engines for too long, but the Atlas hadn't had the advantage of Klaxion-assisted speed. In the middle of the room, Commander Sester, the only Klaxion on board, moved 3 of his 5 identical-sized arms around, attempting to monitor and fix problems before they arose. Watching him work was mesmerizing. But it wasn't just his physical capabilities which made him unique among the engineering crew. Sester was the only being on board who had the capability to calculate the undercurrent parameters on the spot, which was what allowed the ship to move so fast. Even assisted by a computer, any other ship would lose its vector once the speed reached a certain threshold. Cass thought he caught the commander make a slight pause before Ensign Tyler came running up. Tyler was Sester's human counterpart, the one who performed the job Sester couldn't due to his imposing size. "He says you can help over here," Tyler said, out of breath. "We're having trouble containing the plasma." What the hell happened up there? Cass followed him over to the right side of the room, where teams were working on building a sleeve to cover one of the cracked conduits. We encountered the Sill. It didn't go to plan. That's an understatement, Mr. Robeaux. Cass shuddered. Feeling Sester's words flow through him was like water soaking into the ground. He wasn't used to the sensation. How long have we got? Tyler asked. Cass wasn't sure if it was Tyler or Sester asking the question. He glanced over to the Klaxian still making the repairs. Without any eyes, it was difficult to tell if a Klaxian was ever paying attention to him or not. I am always paying attention. Please answer the ensign's question. Not long. We're outside their territory right now. But if they come looking for us, we won't be able to hide. Not long anyway. We need to do everything we can to get the engines back up to full capacity. Are we returning to Coalition space? Tyler attached a piece of the sleeve to the conduit, as another crewman held it in place. Cass glanced at the units feeding the conduit and bent down, checking each connection one by one. The third one was bad, and he yanked it out. I don't know. It depends on what the captain decides. But I doubt we'd come all this way just to turn around and go back empty-handed. In fact, he knew they weren't leaving empty-handed. Guard your thoughts, Mr. Robeaux. I don't want to inadvertently pick up classified orders. Cass attempted to empty his mind. Maybe if Sester didn't want to know, he shouldn't go probing. But then again, he might not have a choice. Maybe it was like someone shouting in an empty room, and unless your ears were covered, you were going to hear what they said whether you wanted to or not. An apt analogy. And thank you for finding the defective connection. You're welcome, Cass said. Tyler glanced over, apparently having been alerted by Sester. Bad connection? Any others? He asked. Not that I see, Cass replied. Okay, let's finish getting this on to reinforce the conduit. He and the rest of the engineering team finished attaching the sleeve, covering the cracks that had formed. Captain pushed us too hard. When we got thrown from the undercurrent, it strained the system. Then, when we had to make a jump without a countdown, it pushed everything past their limits. When you get back up there, do me a favor and remind him this is still an experimental system. We don't have all the safeguards and redundancies a normal coalition ship would have. Is that coming from you or the commander? Cass asked. Tyler took one glance at Sester, then turned back to Cass, puffing out his chest. Both, he said. Keeping his mind clear was harder than he'd anticipated. Cass went from odd job to odd job in engineering, struggling to keep his thoughts on his work. He kept wanting to drift back to the situation with Rutledge, but every time they moved in that direction, he would pull them away, thinking instead about the ship, its design, or anything else. He even tried humming a few times, but it did him no good. And the more he tried not to think about it, the worse it got. By the time most of the repairs were done, his hands shook. I think you have everything under control down here, Cass said, extricating himself from beneath a coolant unit. You guys don't need me anymore. There's still a lot to be done, Tyler said from the control seat beside him. He was in the process of rebooting the coolant acceptance protocols, which allowed the plasma conduits to run twice as hot, with half the ambient heat. I'm sure you can take care of it. Cass threw a wave behind him as he headed for the doors, wanting nothing more than some mental relief. Thank you for working so hard to safeguard your knowledge, Sester said. I know it isn't easy. That's the truth, Cass uttered, leaving engineering and getting halfway down the hall before he relaxed his mind. It was the most soothing relief, and he felt better, as if bags of sand had been lifted from his shoulders. In all the madness, he hadn't had a good chance to process what had happened. The Sill obviously didn't want to talk. That much was clear. So how was he going to get them to listen? Was it even possible? This was what he'd predicted when he'd first started lessons with Laska. Fat lot of good those had done him. Maybe she should have been the one to initiate contact, though the Sill had barely allowed them to get a word in edgewise. If this was going to have any chance of working, he had to find some way of reaching them, something that they wanted, Cass pulled his comm out, tapping it. Box? Here, boss. His voice was muffled. What's going on? Where are you? In the room. Why? I was just checking to make sure everything was okay. We had some trouble with the Sill. You don't say, he replied, his voice emotionless. Cass ground his teeth together. Why was it so hard? But you're okay? No damage? There was a pause on the other side. No damage. I'm fine. His voice was still muffled, and Cass thought he heard another voice coming through the comm. Are you sure? Cass asked. You sound odd. Yep, everything's fine. Go save the ship. Cass stopped in the hallway, furrowing his brow. Something was definitely off. Okay, I'll see you. I have to go, Box said, cutting the connection. Cass stood there, staring at the device for a moment, before taking a deep breath. Box was probably just pissed at being left in that room all day. Cass really needed to remember to request Box get his own quarters. But he'd have to go through Evie, since Paige had apparently set up some kind of requisition net against him. And now wasn't the time. He considered sending a comm to the bridge to ask if they needed his help anymore, but decided against it, putting the comm away again. If they needed him, they'd call. He needed to figure out how to get the Sill's attention without them destroying the ship. And as much as he hated to admit it, he needed to start taking Laska's words seriously. Which meant he'd have to go back to her. Damn, he said under his breath. He didn't even want to know how much pleasure she'd gather from him crawling back. Might as well get it over with. 18. Cass stood in front of the door to the classroom, gathering his courage to face her after his failure on the bridge. He tapped the button beside the door. No answer. He pushed it again, holding longer this time. Still no answer. Running one hand through his hair, he leaned down to the panel and tapped in a simple override code he'd had memorized from his days on the Atlas. Most low-security protocol doors worked on the same system, and needed a little ingenuity to get past them. The high-security doors were another matter, and Box was the one to take care of those for him. The door slid open to reveal an empty room. Of course. Why would she be in here if there was no one to teach? He tapped his comm unit. Locate Negotiator Laska, he said. Primary lounge, the computer replied. Cass raised an eyebrow. What was she doing in there? And during a ship-wide emergency? Weren't all the entertainment facilities automatically closed during ship-wide emergencies? He broke into a trot down a couple of hallways until he reached the hypervator, taking it to level 12. He then broke into a full-blown sprint down to the lounge, thinking something must be wrong if she was in there while everything was shut down. As soon as he reached the large oak doors with glass circles embedded in them, he stopped. Inside the dark room, the negotiator sat, sipping from a glass and staring out the large windows to the planetoids beyond. He stepped forward, but the doors didn't budge. Instead, he used the same code he'd used in the classroom, and they opened easily, swooshing closed behind him. Laska didn't turn or acknowledge him, only took another sip from her glass. Negotiator? He asked. I see I'm not the only accomplished lockpick on this ship, she said. Is everything all right? He asked. She turned to him, her face dead serious. You tell me. Cass dropped his shoulders, standing beside the table she'd leaned up against. Her diminutive stature was subdued by the room, which is also on the small side. It was supposed to provide for a cozier atmosphere, and Laska looked right at home. He shook his head. Take a seat, former commander, she said, indicating the table. He noticed she didn't have her stick he'd come to hate so much. Laska walked over to the bar at the far end of the lounge and pulled a second glass from the shelf and a bottle from underneath the counter. She returned, pouring him a small amount of the amber liquid into the glass.
They told me you can handle your liquor. Give this a shot.
I thought my privileges were revoked, he said.
Only until we reached Sill's space. I always keep my word, she replied.
He picked up the glass, wondering if this was just another one of her tests. But what else did he have to lose? He tipped the glass, the alcohol coating his tongue, then the back of his throat, and all points south. It was so smooth and clean, he couldn't believe he'd never had this particular brand before. His drinks tended to be harsh on his system, but this was like drinking pure bliss.
Good?
She asked. Amazing, he replied, setting the glass down. To be honest, I thought you were going to give me something a lot harsher. She smirked.
After all our time together, what was the one thing you took away about diplomacy? She asked.
He ran back through the rules of diplomacy in his head. But those weren't what she was referring to. This was something simpler, something he had missed.
Everything is a negotiation. You being on this ship even existing, the whole foundation of the coalition, all of it is based on negotiation. On two or more parties coming together and making an agreement. Each time you have an argument, you are negotiating your position.
She took another sip from her glass.
It never ends.
You were waiting for me, he said.
I chose a location which I knew you would find amenable. Somewhere you feel you have the home field advantage. How did I know that?
I'm assuming it wasn't a lucky guess, Cass said, eyeing the glass.
It was because I did my homework. I know as much about you as there is to know, former commander. I probably know you better than you know yourself. And in that, I knew one way or another you'd find yourself here.
I didn't come here for a drink, he said. I was looking for you. She tipped her head back and barked a laugh.
Things didn't go well with the Sill, I take it.
There was no denying it. I need help, he said.
We don't have a lot of time left, Laskus said. One way or another, we'll be drawn into another confrontation with them, and we have to be prepared, if we even survive.
You go up there, Cass said. You can do a better job than I could. Laskus stared out the windows. One of the planetoids moved in between them and the system's star, temporarily sending the room into deep shadow before moving out of the way again.
It isn't my place. They're right. You're the best chance to make this work. But you have to work to your advantage. And you have to be willing to give the Sill something they want to draw them in.
How do I know what they want if they won't talk to us? He asked. Laska tapped the neck of the bottle sitting between them.
The same way I knew where you would show up.
Cass stared at the bottle, thinking. The hint of an idea passed through his head. He wasn't sure it would work, but it might give them what they needed. I think I might know what to do.
Then I would get on it, she replied, because it may look like we're sitting out here peacefully drifting along, but time is growing short.
He nodded. I know. Standing, he took one last look at her, then made his way to the doors. It was a good thing he wasn't a coalition officer anymore, because he was about to break every rule in the book.
Don't forget, she called to him as he reached the doors, every negotiation requires sacrifice from both parties.
Cass nodded and gave her a quick wave, then took off running down the hall. You're back, Tyler said, as Cass rushed into engineering again. I am. I need to check on something for the bridge, he replied, jogging over to the right side of the room. Despite being a brand new engine system, the room was laid out like every other coalition ship. If there was one thing he could count on, it was the constant predictability of the coalition. Things have to be in straight lines, and always in the same order. Cass already recognized the computer lockouts. I didn't see any requests come through, Tyler said. Is it something urgent? I can get my team on it." "Nothing like that," Cass replied. "I'll take care of it." He studied the computer a moment. Tyler lingered behind him before heading off to put out another fire somewhere else. "What are you doing, Mr. Robeaux?" "You have to trust me, Sester," Cass thought, hoping the commander could understand him. "This is the only way to keep the ship in one piece. While I do not question your motives, I do question your methods. Should you not inform the captain of your plan? We don't have time to debate this, and I can't chance he'd rule against me. I have to do this on my own." He tapped a few of the controls, releasing the locks and the sensor logs from the bridge. "Can you help me route all the sensor information collected from our encounter with the Sill to this terminal?" He thought he caught a sigh, only to realize it was a mental one that had washed over him, not an actual verbal noise. "Humans. So complicated. Sometimes I question whether coming on this ship was the right decision." "This helps," Cass whispered as the sensor log information came in. Normally, civilians weren't allowed to see information like this, but as Laska had reminded him more than once, he was former Commander Robeaux. He had clearance, just retroactively. "I hope you're right about that." Pulling up the information Zahl gathered from the encounter, Cass looked for anything familiar. Not that there was much to go on. The energy signatures of the two ships were identical, making them indistinguishable from each other. Though there was one small difference. On the outside of the first ship that had knocked them out of the undercurrent was a small purple symbol painted or maybe etched on the side of the hull. The other Sill vessel had a different blue symbol in the same place. A ship name, perhaps? Or some other kind of identifier. "Sester, does the Tempest have the logs of the Atlas Evie downloaded before the ship was destroyed?" That sigh rumbled through him again. "There is a copy in the computer, but it is secured by the commander's personal ID code." That wouldn't do. He couldn't alert Evie to his plans. If he was right, that was. She would only try to stop him. "I don't suppose you'd—" "No, I will not break into the commander's personal information." Cass took a deep breath. "I know it's a lot, and I'm sorry I'm putting you in this position. Just give me access to that section of the computer. I can do the rest. If you do this, it is paramount to theft. I've seen your fears. They'll imprison you again. If my plan works, they probably won't ever get the chance, but that doesn't matter. What matters is this mission succeeds." Access to Evie's personal database came up on the screen. "This is a trick I learned from the Sargans," Cass thought. "Once I've shown you this, you'll know how to combat it. You may need to rewrite the ship's security protocols when I'm done." Sester didn't respond. Cass went to work, putting the main system into a diagnostic loop, which allowed him to create a quick and easy bot key in the computer, which could produce 1,000,000 password guesses per second. And because the system was in a diagnostic, it didn't send a warning to the main computer someone was breaking in. Less than 12 seconds had passed before he was in. "I'll be taking that up with the captain as soon as we are clear of the Sill," Sester said. "Sometimes the simplest things make for the biggest loopholes." Cass perused Evie's personal documents, resisting the urge to explore them in depth. No, he was looking for a particular file. "Here," he whispered, finding the copy of the database from the Atlas. Inside were all the sensor logs from when it had encountered the Sill. Both times. She'd backed up the entire drive on her personal database before handing it over to the Coalition. It seemed she didn't trust them as much as she professed after all. Cass went back to the first encounter, all those years ago, examining the visual logs of the Sill ship that responded to his original distress call. He found what he was looking for. The same purple symbol on the side of the ship. "It's the same ship," Sester said. "You must inform the captain." "It won't do the captain any good. He can't do anything about it. But I needed confirmation. Sester, you have to give me 20 minutes. Can you do that? Just 20 minutes. I'm not sure. I know I'm asking a lot. But you know I only want the mission to be a success. You have to believe this is nothing insidious."
I can't see what you're planning, but I don't feel any deception behind it.
There was a pause.
20 minutes.
Thanks. That's all I need. Cass closed everything in the system and took it off diagnostic mode, returning it all back to the way he'd found it. He turned to find Ensign Tyler standing behind him with a scowl on his face.
Did you get what the bridge required?
He asked, some sarcasm in his voice. How much had he heard? I did. Thank you. How long until the engines are back up and running?
2 more hours. We have to test to make sure we don't have any more leaks, Tyler said, eyeing him suspiciously.
Cass nodded, pushing past Tyler, and exited through the large doors, doing his best to project confidence. I'll let the captain know, he called back as the doors closed again. People were much less likely to suspect someone who acted like nothing was wrong. Would Sester stop Tyler from reporting him to the captain? He didn't think so. He'd have to be quick. His 20 minutes might have just turned into 5.